There is a photograph of Thomas Shelby at Blackpool Beach, taken on June 15, 1913. He is young. He is smiling. The girl beside him is named Greta, and she is dying of tuberculosis, and he does not know that yet. 6 months later, he will sit at her bedside every day for 3 months, holding her hand, knowing the disease in the air of that room could kill him. He will stay anyway. That boy never came back from France. Every version of Thomas Shelby that 6 seasons of television showed the world, the gang leader, the MP, the grieving husband, the man in the field with the gun, was built on top of something that was already broken before the war started. The tunnels deepened it. Grace dying accelerated it. But the fracture was older than all of that. This is the full story of why Thomas Shelby could never escape himself. Welcome to Between the Episodes. Let's begin. Section 1. The Tunnel That Never Ended. The very first image of Peaky Blinders is not Birmingham. It is not a street, a pub, or a man in a sharp suit walking through smoke. The very first image is dirt, close walls, darkness. 3 men pressed together in a tunnel underground, barely breathing, listening to German voices through the mud that separates them from the enemy. One of those men is Thomas Shelby. He is young. He is terrified. And before the scene can finish, the wall breaks open, the enemy pours in, and Tommy is being strangled on the ground of a trench while his friends are shot around him. Then he wakes up. He is in his bedroom in Birmingham. The war has been over for about a year. He is sweating. His chest is heaving. And within 60 seconds of the opening of a show that will run for 6 full seasons, the audience has been shown everything they actually need to know about Thomas Shelby. Not the razor blades, not the suits, not the ruthlessness. This. A man who cannot sleep without going back to France. That opening nightmare was a diagnosis. During the First World War, Tommy served as what was called a clay kicker, a tunneler or sapper. The job was exactly what it sounds like. Soldiers would dig tunnels beneath enemy lines, moving in complete darkness, in spaces barely wide enough to turn around in, trying to plant explosives that would detonate from below. Cillian Murphy described Tommy's wartime role in an interview with the BBC this way. Tommy was a clay kicker, which meant he tunneled under enemy lines to set explosives, and it was the most claustrophobic, horrific, dark job a person could possibly have. That description matters because it tells you what Tommy was doing on the worst days of his life. He was not charging across open ground with a rifle. He was underground, in the dark, surrounded by dirt on every side, listening for sounds that told him whether the enemy was close enough to break through. The silence was the danger. The quiet meant someone was digging toward you, and you could not yet hear them. The clay kicker's entire war was lived in the gap between quiet and catastrophe, between the sound of nothing and the sound of everything going wrong at once. Tommy and his brothers, Arthur, John, and others including Jeremiah Jesus, were at one point cut off behind enemy lines with no ammunition and no way back. By all logic, they should have died there. Somehow, they did not. And in the way that soldiers sometimes explain the impossible, they came home with an understanding that everything after that moment was extra. Time they were not supposed to have. A life that was borrowed rather than earned. Tommy said at one point that he believed he had died in France. He did not say it as a figure of speech. The full tunnel scene, the one Tommy relived in that opening nightmare, was shown completely in Season 1, Episode 4. Tommy, Danny Whizbang, and Freddie Thorne are crouched in a narrow tunnel, listening. German voices press through the mud wall. Then the wall breaks open. The fight is brutal and close and ugly. Freddy is shot. Tommy is strangled. There is a knife. The camera shows the knife going into a body in close-up. And then the dream ends the way it always ends. Tommy waking up, alone, in a room that suddenly feels like that tunnel. He described this experience to someone in the first season, seeing his bedroom wall the way he had seen the tunnel wall, hearing the sound of imaginary shovels coming through from the other side, and praying every night that the sun would come up before the sounds did. He called it praying that the sun beats the shovels. That is not a metaphor. That is a man describing his nightly experience of the war continuing inside his own head, in the dark, in a room in Birmingham, years after the armistice was signed. The only thing that made sleep possible was opium. Brown opium, smoked from a clay pipe, which Tommy used in Season 1 and Season 2 as the sole way to quiet the tunnels long enough to close his eyes. This was the only medicine that existed for him, in a time when there was no medical language for what he was experiencing, no treatment, no name for it beyond shell shock, and no acknowledgement from the world that any of this was real. He used it alone, in private, with no audience. Every other substance Tommy touched across the series, alcohol, cigarettes, he used in the presence of other people, for reasons that had something to do with performance or control. The opium was different. The opium was for the tunnels. When Tommy came home from France, he threw his war medals into the canal. Both of them, his DCM and his MM, awarded for gallantry in the field. He walked to the cut and dropped them in the water. The man who earned those medals, with acts the army considered brave enough to formally honor, could not look at them, or would not. He came back to Birmingham, and he made the first physical attempt to leave France behind him. And the thing he chose to leave behind was the only official record the country had given him of what he had done there. The medals went in the water. The tunnel stayed. What is worth sitting with, in the specific detail of the medals, is what the act of throwing them away actually meant within the logic of who Tommy was. He did not give them to someone. He did not store them in a box or put them in a drawer where they would be out of sight but still in the world. He dropped them into a canal, which is as permanent a form of disposal as a person can perform without a fire. He was not just putting distance between himself and the memory of the war. He was trying to make the memory unretrievable. He was performing the gesture of someone who understands that the object and the thing it represents are connected, and who hopes that removing the object will eventually weaken the connection. It did not. The connection ran in the opposite direction, not from the medals to the tunnels, but from the tunnels to everything. The tunnels were not a memory stored in a box. They were a physical condition, running through the nervous system, present every time he closed his eyes, and every time a sudden noise arrived without warning. In Season 4, when Tommy tried to live a life of leisure, golfing on his estate in the brief calm between criminal operations, the sound of a hunter's rifle somewhere on the grounds sent him scrambling for cover before his conscious mind registered that the sound was not a threat. His body had already decided. His body was always in the tunnel. His mind just caught up afterward. Danny Whizbang was the show's way of making visible what was happening inside Tommy, at a volume Tommy would never allow himself to perform. Danny barreled through the doors of the Garrison pub in his first appearance in Season 1, knocking over tables, shouting, completely inside a battle that existed only in his own head. The pub, the noise, some combination of sensation had pulled him back to France, and he was there, fully, physically, terrifyingly there, until Tommy and others pulled him out of it. Danny's episodes were called whiz-bang moments after the sound of German artillery shells, because the noise they made in the air was the noise that lived in Danny's head and kept pulling him back. Tommy never had a Danny moment in public. He would not allow it. The control that defined him, the stillness, the quiet voice, the face that gave away nothing, was the mechanism he used to keep his version of the whiz-bang moment private. But the Finity Therapy case study on Tommy's PTSD made the point precisely. Tommy woke regularly with a rapid heartbeat, sweating and shaking, his body producing physical responses to a threat that existed only in memory. He just made sure nobody was there to see it. The management of his own breakdown was itself a form of control, which meant that even his most vulnerable moments were organized around protecting the image of invulnerability he needed the world to see. 3 years into the show, Season 3, Tommy was beaten severely by a group of men working for a secret organization called the Economic League. He was hospitalized, unconscious, filled with morphine. And when he dreamed, his brain took the hospital room and turned it back into the tunnel. Walls of dirt, the dark, the sounds. The morphine that was supposed to manage his pain sent him straight back to France. His mind did not forget. When the defenses were low enough, when the drugs removed his ability to control what he thought about, the tunnel was where he went. It was where he always went. By Season 6, the tunnel had moved. For every previous season, the nightmares and flashbacks were contained to sleep, to the moments when Tommy was unconscious or chemically reduced. But in Season 6, a vision connected to the tunnel. A thing the show called the Gray Man appeared to Tommy in his office at the Houses of Parliament. In his Westminster office, in the middle of the day, fully awake, fully sober, the hallucination that belonged to France reached out of his sleep and stood in front of him in the building where laws are made. That is 20 years after the war ended. That is the entire span of the show, from 1919 to the mid-1930s, with the tunnel growing rather than shrinking. Not fading with time, growing. There is something specific about the clay kicker experience that explains why Tommy's trauma never loosened its grip the way the trauma of other veterans might. A soldier who fought in the open, in fields, in trenches, in places where the sky existed, came home with nightmares tied to what he had seen. Tommy came home with nightmares tied to a sensation. The claustrophobia of the tunnel, the impossibility of escape, the knowledge that the enemy could be on the other side of the wall you are currently pressed against. That is not an image. That is a physical feeling. And physical feelings do not respond to logic or time the way images sometimes can. You cannot argue yourself out of knowing what it felt like to be strangled in the dark. This is why Tommy's control, the famous stillness, the quiet voice, the absolute insistence on knowing every angle of every room he enters, makes complete sense. The clay kicker learns that survival requires knowing where the danger is before it arrives. In the tunnels, the difference between living and dying was the quality of your listening. Tommy brought that listening home with him and applied it to everything. The gang, the family, the political enemies, the businesses. He is always in the tunnel, always listening to the wall, always calculating where the shovel sounds are coming from. The opium stopped when Grace arrived. She gave him enough peace that he could sleep without it. That is not a small thing. That is a person managing to turn down the volume on something that had been screaming in his head for years. The tunnels went quiet. Then Grace died, and the opium came back. The man who threw his medals in the canal thought he was throwing France away. What he was actually doing was the first in a long series of attempts to put something down that could not be put down. He would try again with every season that followed. With money, with legitimacy, with love, with political power, with sobriety. The tunnel did not care. The tunnel was not located in his history. The tunnel was located in him. And you cannot throw yourself in the canal. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What the tunnels did to Thomas Shelby explains the shape of his entire life. But the tunnels were not the beginning of his story. Before France, before the clay kicking, before the shovels and the dark and the strangling, there was a girl, and she had already broken something in him that the war then made impossible to fix. Section 2. The girl before France. Before the war, Thomas Shelby could smile. That detail sounds simple. It is not. The Tommy Shelby that 6 seasons of television introduced to the world was a man whose face was essentially a closed door. Still, cold. A face that gave away nothing and asked for nothing in return. The people around him, his brothers, his enemies, the women who loved him, all had to read meaning into silences, into small movements, into the things he did not say. The smile, if it came at all, came briefly and was gone before you could be sure you had seen it. But there are people in the show who knew Thomas Shelby before France, and what they describe is a completely different person. Kitty Gerosi knew Tommy before the war. Her testimony about him came through Jesse Eden in Season 4, Episode 3, when Jesse visited Tommy at his home and shared what Kitty had told her. Before France, Tommy was cheerful. He was sensitive. He had strong moral principles. Kitty described a specific moment. Tommy once saw a man twice his size hitting a horse and walked straight up to confront him. Not because someone asked him to, not because there was anything in it for him, just because a horse was being hit and it was wrong. That was the person Thomas Shelby was before the war took him underground. Greta Gerosi was Kitty's sister, and she was the first person Tommy ever loved. The facts of their relationship are confirmed in the Peaky Blinders wiki and in the show itself. Sometime before 1914, Tommy fell deeply in love with Greta, a girl of Italian descent, the daughter of a family that did not immediately welcome a Romani boy from Smallheath into their home. Her parents did not approve at first. The gap between who Tommy was and who they wanted their daughter to be with was wide enough to be a problem. Tommy crossed it anyway. He won them over. Not through violence or leverage or manipulation, the tools that would later define him, but through charm and genuine sweetness. He won them over by being himself, the self that the war had not yet touched. The relationship between Tommy and Greta was the only one in his entire story that existed entirely outside the context of danger. Every significant relationship Tommy had after the war was built inside a structure of threat. Grace was a spy before she was his lover. His connection to Lizzie began as an employer-employee arrangement that he used for physical comfort after grief. Every ally he cultivated came with conditions attached. Greta was none of that. She was just a girl he loved before the world taught him what love cost. Then she got sick. Greta developed tuberculosis, consumption as it was called then. A disease of the lungs that was not well understood, not easily treated, and highly contagious. The bacteria that caused it could spread through the air, through close contact, through something as simple as sitting beside a sick person for long enough. In the early 1900s, there was no reliable cure. Doctors understood it was infectious. Families understood that staying close to someone with consumption was taking a risk with your own life. Tommy stayed. For 3 months, he was at Greta's bedside every day. Every single day. Holding her hand. knowing what the disease could do to him, knowing that the air in that room was dangerous and that his presence there was not medically rational. He stayed anyway, because she was dying and he loved her, and that was a complete enough reason for the person he was then. Greta died. She was 19 years old. Jesse Eden returned a photograph to Tommy during that season 4 conversation. A picture of him and Greta at Blackpool Beach, taken on June 15, 1913. On the back, someone had written, "Wild Rovers beside the seaside." The photograph showed a version of Tommy that the show's audience had never seen and would never see again. A young man at the beach with the girl he loved, before any of it happened. Tommy looked at that photograph for a moment and then moved on. The way he always moved on. By not stopping, by keeping the forward momentum going so that nothing could catch up with him. But the photograph had already done its work. It had confirmed something the show had been building toward quietly. There was a version of Thomas Shelby who existed before the tunnels, before the razor blades, before all of it. And that version of him was capable of sitting next to someone dying of a contagious disease for 3 months out of nothing more than love. The distance between that man and the man the show spent 6 seasons following is the entire tragedy. Before Greta died, Tommy made her a promise. He told her he would change the world. A young man in love, watching the person he cared about most leaving the world too early, making the kind of promise that young men make when they have no other way to fight the thing that is taking someone from them. He could not save her. He could not cure consumption. He could not do anything except hold her hand and promise that the world she was leaving would be different because of him. He carried that promise into the war. He carried it home from France. He carried it through every season of the show, through the criminal empire, through Parliament, through every deal and alliance and scheme. The Den of Geek piece on the Season 6 Tuberculoma confirmed it directly. By the end of the story, Tommy was still trying to fulfill the youthful promise he had made to a dying girl in 1913 or 1914. The Shelby Company, the seat in Parliament, the attempt to change the conditions of working-class Birmingham, all of it, underneath everything, pointed back to a bedside where a boy held a dying girl's hand and told her the world would be better. What the promise also did, though, was something nobody talks about when they talk about Thomas Shelby. It made leaving impossible. Once you have made that kind of promise, a promise to a person who died before she could hold you to it, a promise made in grief and love and helplessness, you are bound to something that can never release you. Greta could not tell him he had done enough. She could not tell him the world was different now, that he could rest. There was no version of success clear enough or large enough to constitute fulfillment of a promise made at a deathbed in 1913. So Tommy kept moving. Season after season, deal after deal, enemy after enemy. Not because he was greedy or power-hungry in the simple way people sometimes described him. Because stopping meant admitting that the world was not yet changed enough, and that was the same as admitting the promise was unfulfilled. And that was the same as failing Greta. The tuberculoma that Tommy was diagnosed with in Season 6, even though it later turned out to be a false diagnosis planted by Mosley's doctor, carried a detail that the show left quietly devastating. The bacteria that causes tuberculosis was the same bacteria that killed Ruby, Tommy's daughter, in Season 6. The Den of Geek analysis of that storyline raised the possibility that Tommy may have been carrying that bacteria in his body since 1913, contracted from Greta's bedside, where he sat for 3 months knowing it was dangerous. Latent in him for 20 years, dormant through both wars and every decade of crime and politics that followed. then resurfacing when his daughter died of the same disease. The show never confirmed this medically, but it stated it as a possibility. And the possibility is poetic in the darkest way. That the act of love which defined Tommy before the war, the choice to stay at Greta's side despite the risk, may have planted something in his body that tried to kill him a generation later. His first love left a mark on him that his own biology carried forward without his knowledge or consent. He could not escape Greta any more than he could escape the tunnels. She was also in him, also permanent, also something that showed up again when the defenses were low enough. There is one more detail from that Season 4 conversation that deserves attention. When Jessie Eden handed Tommy the photograph, she told him what Kitty had said, that Tommy had been a sweet boy, that he had moral principles, that he confronted men who hit horses. Tommy heard this account of himself like it was a description of a stranger. The cheerful, sensitive boy at Blackpool Beach had nothing visible in common with the man sitting in that room in 1926. But Tommy had not stopped being that person. He had buried him, pressed him down under the weight of France and grief and the years of doing what needed to be done, until the original Tommy was so far underneath that even the people who loved him could not see him anymore. But the bedside was still there. The 3 months of holding Greta's hand was still in him. Season 6 would prove it in the most painful way possible, by showing what happened when Tommy had the chance to be at a bedside again and chose instead to chase the curse. He went looking for Esme while his daughter Ruby lay dying in the hospital. He was not there when she died. The boy who stayed for 3 months with Greta became a man who was absent for the last hours of his own child. That is not a simple shift or a gradual change. That is a portrait of what a war does to a person's capacity for stillness. Tommy before France could sit with pain. Tommy after France could only move through it. The tunnel had taught him that staying in one place was how you died. And he had learned that lesson so completely that he could not unlearn it, even when his 7-year-old daughter needed him to sit beside her and hold her hand, the same way he had once sat beside Greta. Grace's death, which came between Greta and Ruby, made the pattern complete. 3 losses, 3 women, each one taken by something Tommy could not fight with the tools he had. And each loss moving him further from the boy at Blackpool Beach, further from the person who could sit still with someone he loved and just be present. The medals in the canal were Tommy's attempt to throw France away. He could not throw Greta away. She was not a season of his life. She was the before. And everything the show called Thomas Shelby was actually the after. The shape of a person rebuilt around an absence that was already there when the war started. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Grace and what her loss turned into across 3 seasons of the show is a different story. But it begins in the same place Greta's story began, with Tommy believing, briefly, that he was allowed to be loved. And what happens when the world answers that belief is what the middle of this story is built around. Section 3. The one thing that quieted the tunnels. Grace Burgess walked into the Garrison pub in 1919, and Thomas Shelby stopped sleeping with the opium pipe. That is the most important sentence about their relationship. Not the romance, not the tragedy, not the death. The fact that a woman walked into his life and the tunnels went quiet. For the first time since France, Tommy did not need the pipe to sleep. He did not need to drug himself into unconsciousness to escape the sounds inside his own head. Grace arrived, and something in him settled. the way a storm settles when the pressure finally breaks. That detail is the measure of what she meant to him. Not what he said about her. What she did to the part of him he could not control. Grace came to the garrison as a barmaid. That was the cover. The truth was that she was working undercover for Inspector Chester Campbell, a police chief inspector sent by Winston Churchill to Birmingham with one job: find the stolen guns the Peaky Blinders had taken from the Birmingham small arms factory. Campbell needed someone close to Tommy. Grace was trained as an operative. Her father had been a police officer, a colleague of Campbell's, killed by the IRA. She knew how to present herself as something she was not, and the garrison needed a barmaid, and Tommy needed watching. She was not there to fall in love with him. He was not supposed to fall in love with her. The pull between them was visible from the first episode. Tommy noticed her immediately. Not in the simple way a man notices an attractive woman in a pub, but in the way a man who has learned to read every room he enters notices something that does not quite fit. She was educated. She was refined. She was too calm for the environment. He knew, on some level, that she did not belong there the way she was presenting herself. He offered her a job keeping the books for the Shelby business because Arthur was incompetent with money, and because keeping her close was smarter than letting her operate at a distance he could not monitor. He was already protecting himself from her before he understood he needed protecting. Their first real test came at the Cheltenham races. Tommy brought Grace as his date. And then, in one of the show's most uncomfortable early scenes, offered her to Billy Kimber as part of a business arrangement, essentially using her as a bargaining chip in a deal he needed closed. He let Kimber take her to his house. Then, at the last possible moment, he came through the door and stopped it, claiming she had a disease, to get her out without a fight. He put her in the position of being offered to another man, and then rescued her from it. This is who Tommy was before Grace changed something in him. A man who could use people first and feel things about it afterward. A man whose instinct toward those he was beginning to care about was to place them in danger and then pull them back. Because testing the limits of what he was willing to do was the only way he knew how to measure what something meant to him. Grace, for her part, was doing her job. She gathered information. She fed it back to Campbell. She located where the stolen guns were hidden and reported it. She did what she had been sent to Birmingham to do. And somewhere in the middle of doing it, she stopped being able to do it cleanly. Her feelings for Tommy became real. Real enough that when Campbell found the guns, all of them except one, and proposed marriage to her as a reward, she rejected him. She resigned from her position as his operative. She chose Tommy over the job she had been sent to do. Campbell did not accept this gracefully. The end of Season 1 is partly the story of what happens when a man in authority is rejected by a woman he believed was obligated to him. He went after Tommy with everything he had. Grace helped Tommy hide from the police. They ended up at her home together. And the day before the Black Star confrontation, the day before Tommy went to take down Billy Kimber and take over the Birmingham races, Grace tried to tell him the truth, that she had been a spy, that she had betrayed him. The moment was interrupted before she could finish. Tommy killed Kimber the next day. He wrote Grace a letter telling her he would give her his decision, about them, about everything, within 3 days. He posted it to her. Then Campbell intercepted Grace at the train station, pointed a gun at her, and a gunshot was heard as the screen cut to black. The end of Season 1 left the audience believing she might be dead. She was not. She came back in the last 2 episodes of Season 2, alive and married to another man, a wealthy American who could give her a life far from Birmingham. She had a son with that man, Charles. Except Charles was Tommy's son. She had been pregnant with Tommy's child when she left England. Her husband knew. He raised Charles as his own. Then her husband died. The wiki confirms by suicide. And Grace came back to Tommy. In Season 3, Episode 1, they got married. 1 episode. That is how long the marriage lasted before the world broke it. What the 1 episode of marriage represents in the context of everything that preceded it is worth staying with for a moment. Tommy and Grace had circled each other across 2 full seasons. Through her betrayal, through his discovery of it, through her leaving, through her return married to someone else, through the years of separation and the child they shared without sharing it. They had covered enormous ground and enormous time before arriving at the wedding. The marriage was not a beginning. It was a long time coming. And it lasted 1 episode. There is also something in the specific quality of what Grace represented to Tommy that goes beyond the usual accounting of love and loss. The Den of Geek analysis of Season 5 made a point about how Grace appeared in his hallucinations across the later seasons, recreating the exact moment when she first offered to sing at the garrison and asked him whether he wanted a happy song or a sad one. He chose sad. She warned him she would break his heart. He told her his heart was already broken. The show brought that exchange back years later because it contained the whole story in miniature. Tommy had told Grace the truth about himself in that moment, honestly, almost casually, in a way he almost never told anyone the truth about himself. His heart was already broken. He said it like a fact. And Grace had heard it and stayed anyway. That was the thing she did that nobody else in his life managed with the same consistency. She heard the actual version of him, not the controlled, tactical, impenetrable public version, but the version underneath it, and she did not leave. She did not fix it or argue with it or try to manage it. She heard it and stayed and offered him a sad song because he had asked for one. In the tunnel language that Tommy understood the world through, she was the first person who had listened through the wall and not broken through it. Just listened. And somehow that was enough to make the wall feel less like a threat for the first time since France. At the Shelby Charity Foundation dinner in Season 3, Episode 2, Tommy gave Grace a sapphire. He had received it from a Russian contact named Mr. Romanov as payment for a job. And a woman named Tatiana Petrovna had warned Tommy before the dinner that the stone was cursed. He gave it to Grace anyway. Whether he believed the warning, did not believe it, or believed it and gave it to her regardless, is something the show deliberately leaves unclear. What is clear is that the sapphire was on Grace's neck when the assassin arrived. A man entered the dinner and shouted the words, "For Angel," Angel Changretta, whose throat John Shelby had cut, and fired a shot intended for Tommy. Grace was hit instead. The Peaky Blinders beat the assassin immediately. Tommy called for an ambulance. Grace died in his arms. 1 episode married, 1 episode a widow. After her death, Tommy took the sapphire to a Romani woman named Bethany Boswell and asked her if the stone was truly cursed. She told him it was. He left it with her and went home. He told himself the curse had caused it. He told himself an outside force had taken Grace from him. But in quieter moments, the ones the show allowed to breathe without dialogue, a different accounting was available. Grace was shot by a bullet meant for Tommy. She was at that dinner because she was his wife. She was his wife because he had allowed her back into his life after years of separation. She was wearing the sapphire because he had placed it around her neck that same evening, ignoring or dismissing the warning about what it meant. Tommy did not cause Grace's death. He also could not look at the sequence of decisions that led to it and find one that was not his. That combination, not guilty but responsible, is the specific kind of weight that does not lift with time. It is not something a person can argue their way out of or drink their way past, because it is technically true in both directions simultaneously. About a month after Grace's death, Tommy began sleeping with Lizzie Stark, his secretary, a woman he employed, a woman who had worked as a prostitute before he hired her, a woman who cared about him in ways he could not at that point receive. Lizzie herself described the arrangement to Polly and Esme in Season 3, Episode 4, with barely disguised anger. She said something close to, "They did not really sleep," that it was not that kind of comfort, that it was physical and it was rough, and it was not what most people would call being comforted. Tommy told his family at the end of Season 3 that Lizzie was the one who stopped his heart from breaking on some nights after Grace's death. He said this at a family meeting in front of his brothers and aunt as a statement of fact rather than an expression of feeling. It was the most clinical possible way to describe being kept alive by another person's presence. Lizzie stopped his heart from breaking. Not because he loved her, because she was there, and he needed something to be there, and she was willing. The opium came back after Grace died. The tunnels came back. Everything that Grace had quieted returned with the same force it had carried before she arrived, and some additional weight besides. Because now there was a new thing to add to the tunnel sounds: her last breaths. The show confirmed that the female breathing sounds that accompanied Tommy's hallucinations of Grace in later seasons were meant to represent the sounds of Grace dying in his arms at that dinner. He did not just lose a person. He lost the only evidence he had that the tunnels could be survived without chemicals. Grace had been the proof that something in him could settle. Her death was the proof that peace, for Thomas Shelby, was temporary by nature and paid for in advance. He named a charity institute after her. He had her portrait hung in it. He built a public monument to a private grief and then continued walking through a world from which the thing that had made it bearable had been removed. Not collapsing, not stopping, just continuing, the way he always continued, with one more thing pressing against the tunnel wall. The institute itself, the Grace Shelby Institute for Orphaned Children, appeared in the opening of Season 3, Episode 6. Tommy gave a short speech at its opening. Father Hughes arrived, telling Tommy that his invitation must have been lost. The portrait of Grace hung in the hall. Tommy stood in front of it while the world moved around him and the function of the event continued. He had built a building named after her and filled it with children who had no parents, and he stood inside it, moving through the formal requirements of an opening ceremony while her face watched from a portrait on the wall. The gesture contained everything: the love, the guilt, the need to put the grief somewhere visible and permanent, and the absolute inability to actually feel any of it in public. Grace appeared to him again. Not in photographs or in the memories that surface when a person is quiet enough to let them in. She appeared to him in waking hallucinations, in the Garrison pub where she had first worked, in fields near his house, in his office in Parliament. She kept coming back. And what she said when she came back was something far darker than comfort. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What the ghost of Grace told Thomas Shelby across the seasons that followed her death is where the full weight of what he had lost becomes impossible to separate from the shape of his destruction. She did not come back to reassure him. She came back with a message. And that message is why the Season 5 finale ends the way it ends. A man in a field with a gun against his own head, screaming into the dark. Section 4. The Ghost That Wanted Him Dead. Grace Shelby came back. Not in the way a memory comes back, surfacing briefly when something familiar triggers it, then fading again when the moment passes. She came back the way a presence fills a room, standing in front of him, speaking to him, close enough that he could have reached out and touched her if she had been real. She was not real, and she was not there to comfort him. The hallucinations of Grace began in Season 3 and continued through Season 5, growing more frequent and more specific with each season. What changed across those 3 seasons was not the frequency alone. What changed was the message. In the earlier appearances, Grace was connected to pain and guilt. She was what Tommy saw when his mind broke through its own defenses and showed him what was underneath. But by Season 5, the ghost of Grace had developed a clear and consistent instruction. She wanted Tommy to die. She wanted him to come and join her wherever she was. And every time she appeared in Season 5, she moved him one step closer to agreeing. The Den of Geek analysis of Season 5 documented the pattern precisely. At least once per episode across that season, Tommy either hallucinated Grace or found himself in a situation that pulled toward his own death, standing on a ledge above a canal, raising his fist above a landmine, holding a gun to his head. The death wish was present throughout, and Grace was its most direct expression. The Peaky Blinders wiki confirmed the central message she carried. She appeared to convince him to take his own life, repeating versions of the same invitation across multiple episodes. In Season 5, Episode 1, after Tommy drank from a vial of laudanum, Grace appeared at his campfire. She told him he had to listen to the voices he heard and do what they told him to do. That was the instruction, not reassurance, not love. An instruction to obey whatever was pulling him toward the edge. She appeared again in Season 5, Episode 4, in Tommy's office at the Houses of Parliament after a visit from Mosley. She was holding the blue sapphire, the stone he had given her on the night she was shot. In earlier seasons, when the sapphire appeared in his visions, it was just the stone. In Season 5, the stone turned to blood in her hands, the blood from the gunshot wound in her chest. She told him in that episode that it had not been the blue stone that caused her death. She said it was him. That sentence landed differently than anything she had said in prior hallucinations. Every other explanation Tommy had been able to construct around Grace's death, the curse, the Changretta family's revenge, the chaos of the world he operated in, left some distance between Tommy and direct responsibility. The stone was cursed. The assassin was hired by an enemy. The bullet was meant for him, not her. These were true facts. They were also the facts Tommy arranged in his mind to create a barrier between himself and the full weight of what had happened. The ghost removed the barrier. She walked into his Parliament office holding a bleeding stone and told him the simple version of the truth that he had been organizing his thoughts to avoid. She was dead because of him. Not because of a curse, not because of the Changretta family operating in isolation, because of him. The choices he had made, the world he had built, the life he had insisted on living despite knowing what it cost the people closest to him. Earlier in Season 3, the show had given a different kind of hallucination, one that was less about guilt and more about physical breaking. After Tommy was beaten badly by the Economic League, he was hospitalized and filled with morphine. His dreams in that hospital room transposed the space back into the WWI tunnel. The hospital walls became dirt walls. The room became France. Even the thing meant to manage his pain, the morphine drip, sent him directly back to the worst place his mind contained. His brain had no safe location. Every form of unconsciousness was a door back to the tunnel, or back to Grace, or back to both simultaneously. In Season 3, there was also the episode involving Tatiana Petrovna, the Russian aristocrat Tommy was dealing with as part of the armored vehicle business. During a physical encounter between them, Tatiana deliberately choked him. She did this intentionally, knowing that the loss of oxygen would trigger a hallucination, and Tommy saw Grace in her place. He was with a woman he had no emotional investment in, and his mind replaced her with the face of the woman he had lost. Tatiana had essentially used his grief as a tool, a manipulation that Tommy recognized afterward, and that showed, starkly, how available his pain was to anyone willing to reach for it. By Season 5, the relationship between Tommy and Grace's ghost had moved far beyond grief into something the show was unambiguous about. The Peaky Blinders wiki stated it plainly. The apparition that appeared to Tommy repeatedly in 1929 was trying to convince him to take his own life. The wiki also confirmed something specific about the sounds that accompanied these hallucinations. The female breathing that formed their background was meant to represent Grace's last breaths as she died in Tommy's arms at the dinner in Season 3. Every hallucination was scored by the sound of her dying. He could not see her without hearing her die at the same time. Twice in Season 5, Grace recreated a specific moment from their first real connection in Season 1. She appeared to Tommy and asked him, "Happy or sad?" Those had been her exact words in the Garrison pub when she first offered to sing for him. He had chosen sad. She had told him before she sang that she would break his heart. He had told her his heart was already broken. The show brought that exchange back in Season 5 to make a point about the distance between who Tommy had been in that moment and who he had become by 1929. The man who said his heart was already broken in 1919 was speaking with some of the casual toughness of a man presenting himself as beyond feeling. By Season 5, the broken heart was not a presentation. It was an accurate description of internal damage. And the ghost of Grace standing in the Garrison pub asking, "Happy or sad?" was the show placing the before and the after in the same frame. The answer in 1929 was not happy. The answer in 1929 was a man who had stopped sleeping again, who was back on laudanum, who was seeing hallucinations in his Parliament office during the working day, whose plan to assassinate Mosley was beginning to collapse around him, and whose family was fracturing under the pressure of Michael Gray's ambitions and the Billy Boy's aggression and the accumulated cost of every decision Tommy had ever made. The plan to assassinate Mosley failed. The plan had involved Barney Thompson, a soldier Tommy had known during the war who had been confined to a mental asylum in the years since France. Tommy had gone to the asylum to find him, recruited him, and built a scheme around Barney's ability with a rifle. Barney was killed when the plan collapsed. Aberama Gold was killed. And Polly Gray, Tommy's aunt, the woman who had kept the Shelby family alive while Tommy and his brothers were in France, the moral center of the family across 5 seasons, was assassinated by IRA members connected to the fascist movement. The same night, the same plan. Everything failed at once. Tommy walked away from all of it with Arthur. They walked into a field near Tommy's country house. Arthur left him there and went ahead. Tommy stood alone in the dark. Grace appeared. She told him the work was all done. She told him they could walk away from all of it. She said it was easy. She said it was soft. She said it was such a small change, the smallest possible change a person could make. The phrasing of that last line was deliberate and devastating. A small change. As if dying were not the largest thing a person could do, but merely a minor adjustment. A step from one state into another. She made it sound like rest. Tommy pointed the gun at his own head and screamed. The gun was empty. Arthur had removed all the bullets before walking ahead. Tommy did not know this. He was not performing a gesture or testing himself. He was at the end of something. The end of a season. The end of a decade of accumulating loss. The end of whatever reserves had kept him functional across all of it. He stood in that field, fully intending to die. The only thing that separated him from death was his brother's silent act of removing 6 bullets from a chamber without being asked and without saying a word about it. Tommy collapsed in the mud. His wife Lizzie came out to tell him he had a phone call waiting. The world resumed. The question the show had been building across season 5, and really across all 5 seasons, was not whether Tommy would eventually break. The tunnel nightmare in episode 1 told the audience he was already broken. The question was whether the thing he was running from would eventually catch him. In the field at the end of season 5, it caught him. He stood still for long enough to let it. And what had caught him was not the Mosley plan failing, or Polly dying, or Michael's betrayal. All of those things with a push. What caught him was grace. The specific shape his grief had taken, the voice it had found, the argument it had been making since the dinner in season 3. She had been telling him for 2 years that the work was done, that he could stop. She was not wrong that he was exhausted. She was not wrong that the cost of being Thomas Shelby had become almost impossible to calculate. What she represented was the part of him that had been ready to stop long before the field. The part that found the opium and the laudanum and the sleepless nights acceptable terms only because he had not yet found a reason to accept the final alternative. The gun was empty. He was alive. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But season 6 was waiting. And the thing about surviving one moment of wanting to die is that the reasons behind it do not leave just because the moment passed. Tommy walked back into his life with all of them still in place. The grief, the guilt, the accumulated damage. And then the world took something else from him. Something smaller and more helpless, and more innocent than any of the enemies and rivals and losses that had come before. Something he had been completely unable to protect. Section 5. The bedside he didn't keep. Ruby Shelby was 7 years old. She was the daughter of Tommy and Lizzie. She had a brother named Charles. She lived in the large house Tommy had built as a monument to everything he had achieved and everything he believed he had become. By season 6, Tommy had been sober for 4 years. He had stayed away from alcohol. He was still a Labor MP. He was attempting, in the way he always attempted things, through strategy and forward movement and a refusal to look directly at what he was actually feeling, to be a different kind of person than the one France had made him. Ruby got sick. In season 6, episode 2, Ruby developed tuberculosis. The show used the older word for it, consumption, a disease of the lungs. A disease that, in the 1930s, when this part of the story is set, was still not easily beaten. Doctors had treatments. Gold salts, a substance called sanocrisin, were injected in an attempt to fight the infection. The treatments caused harsh side effects. They also, as medical history confirms and as the show depicted, did not reliably work. Ruby received them anyway, because Tommy was willing to spend any amount of money and exhaust every available option before accepting what the disease was doing to his daughter. Before the gold salts stopped working, and before the illness reached its final stage, Ruby began to show symptoms that went beyond the physical. She started hallucinating. She drew images of a figure she called the Gray Man, a man with yellow teeth and green eyes who appeared to her in her sick state. She repeated a Romani phrase over and over. Tikna mora obeng. Those words, spoken in the Romani language connected to Tommy's gypsy heritage, carried a meaning rooted in that tradition. Ruby was seeing something, or believed she was seeing something, and the phrase she kept repeating was her way of describing it. Tommy heard the phrase and the hallucinations, and made a decision that was completely consistent with everything the show had established about him. He reached for the framework that had always sat alongside his calculated, tactical mind. The Romani belief system he had inherited from his family's heritage. The world of curses and second sight, and meanings carried in objects and bloodlines. Tommy had never been entirely rational. He had gone to Romani women after Grace's death to ask about the sapphire. He had read signs and omens throughout the show. When his daughter started repeating Romani words and seeing a gray man, he believed it meant something specific. He believed a curse was responsible. Esme Shelby Lee, the widow of his brother John, who had been killed in Season 4, had left the Shelby world after John's death and gone back to live among Romani people. She was raising her children away from Birmingham, away from everything the Shelby name meant. Tommy had not been in contact with her for years, but Esme had knowledge of the Romani tradition that Tommy needed, and so he went to find her. Esme's explanation connected the curse to the sapphire, the same stone that Grace had been wearing when she was shot, the same stone that Tommy had subsequently given to Bethany Boswell, who had given it to her sister, Evadne Barwell. The Barwell family had placed the stone around a 7-year-old girl named Connie's neck. Connie had quickly developed a cough. Connie had died, and now Evadne, according to Esme, had turned whatever remained of the curse back toward the Shelby family, toward Tommy's own 7-year-old daughter. Whether a viewer accepts the curse as a real force within the show's world, or reads it as Tommy's mind reaching for an explanation that gave his grief somewhere to go, what matters is what Tommy did with the information. He went looking for Esme. He found her. He got the explanation he had gone looking for. And while he was doing all of this, while he was pursuing the curse across the distance between Birmingham and wherever Esme had settled, Ruby died. He was not there. Lizzie was there. The hospital was there. Charles, Ruby's brother, was presumably somewhere nearby. But Tommy, who had gone to find a way to save his daughter by lifting a curse that he believed was killing her, was absent for the moment his daughter left the world. The parallel that the show was drawing here is not subtle, if you have been paying attention to the full story. Before the war, before France, before the tunnels, before any of it, a girl named Greta Gerosi was dying of tuberculosis. Tommy was 23 or 24 years old. He sat at Greta's bedside every day for 3 months, holding her hand, despite the disease being contagious and his presence there being a genuine risk to his own health. He did not go looking for a cure. He did not try to fix it through action or strategy or movement. He stayed. He was present. He held her hand while the disease took her, and he stayed until the end. In 1934, Tommy's 7-year-old daughter was dying of the same disease, and Tommy was somewhere else, chasing a curse. The boy who sat at Greta's bedside for 3 months had become a man who could not sit still long enough to be present at his daughter's death. The war had taught him that stillness was how you died in a tunnel.
Movement was survival.
Every season of the show had reinforced that lesson. Stay still, and the enemy catches up with you. Keep moving, and you remain one step ahead. Tommy had applied that principle to grief, to loss, to pain, to everything. He moved through it. He did not sit with it. Ruby needed him to sit with her. He could not do it. He could not be Greta's Tommy anymore. That version of him had not come back from France. When Tommy received the news that Ruby had died, he did not collapse in the way the Season 5 field represented collapse. He turned it into action. This was the consistent pattern. Grief becoming fuel. Loss becoming direction. He went to the Barwell family. He arrived at their camp with guns and shot Evadne Barwell and several of her people. He killed the woman he believed had cursed his daughter. Then he went back. At Ruby's funeral, depicted in Season 6, Episode 4, Tommy tried to get Arthur to speak on his behalf. Arthur refused.
He was in serious withdrawal from the opium addiction he had developed through the Chinese business Tommy had been running, and he could not function well enough to stand up and speak. Tommy delivered the eulogy himself. He promised to make those responsible pay. Lizzie stood beside the burial carriage and wanted a moment, one last moment, to look at the casket. Tommy lit the carriage on fire while she was still looking. He burned it and walked away. Lizzie knew immediately where he had gone afterward. She was furious. She knew what Tommy had done to the Barwell family, and she knew that he had framed his daughter's death as an enemy problem, requiring an enemy response, rather than a loss requiring presence and grief and the willingness to feel it without converting it into violence. They had an argument at the house that showed something the show rarely displayed. Tommy losing control of his composure in front of his wife. Showing emotion he normally kept pressed so far beneath the surface that most people forgot it was there at all. Then Arthur came. He was in the basement, in bad shape, struggling through withdrawal. Tommy went down to sit with him. They talked about the past, a specific fight they had once had over cigarettes from when they were young, before everything. Arthur admitted that he had let Tommy win that fight and had always known it. He had stepped back so Tommy could step forward, and he had been doing versions of that same thing for their entire lives. The sacrifice was not just from that one fight. It was decades of the older brother allowing the younger one to lead, to win, to be the one the family followed. Tommy broke his 4 years of sobriety in that basement. He drank with Arthur. One drink, together. Two men who had survived things that should have killed them, sitting in a basement beneath the ruin of what the Shelby family had become by 1934. Then the doctor's letter arrived. Tommy had been having seizures. They had started during his voyage back from America at the beginning of Season 6 and had continued, alongside hallucinations and moments of weakness that he had been dismissing and ignoring in the way he dismissed and ignored everything that threatened his ability to function. Lizzie had been urging him to see a doctor. He had refused. After Ruby's death, the letter from the hospital became impossible to keep ignoring. Dr. Holford, the doctor Tommy eventually agreed to see, delivered the news in Season 6, Episode 4. The bacteria from Ruby's tuberculosis had spread to Tommy. His lungs were clear of active tuberculosis, but there was a shadow at the base of his skull. A tuberculoma, a mass caused by the same bacteria that had killed Ruby. It was rapidly expanding. It was in a position at the base of the brain where operating on it was not possible. There was no surgical option, no cure, no available treatment that would stop its growth. Tommy had between 12 and 18 months to live. The doctor explained that the condition was responsible for the seizures, the hallucinations, and the erratic behavior Tommy had been experiencing. The show had established that Tommy was having these symptoms before Ruby became ill. which meant, as the show carefully implied without stating directly, that the tuberculoma may have been growing in him longer than the timeline of Ruby's illness would suggest. It may have been there for years. It may have been there since before the war, contracted during the 3 months Tommy spent at Greta's bedside in 1913 or 1914, lying dormant inside him across the entire span of the story. His first love, the first person who broke something in him, may have left behind a physical mark that spent 20 years growing quietly in the one part of his body where it could not be removed. The seed of his death planted by the act of staying, the one act of unconditional presence that defined who he was before France. The staying that he could never replicate afterward. The thing the tunnel had taken from him. Tommy heard the diagnosis and did not immediately break. He processed it the way he processed everything, turning it into a timeline, a set of conditions, a problem with parameters. He had 12 to 18 months. There were things he still needed to do. There was the promise to Greta about changing the world. There were people who needed to be arranged and protected before he was gone. He began to prepare for death the way a general prepares a position, methodically, with attention to the pieces that needed to be moved and the ones that needed to be left behind. But the diagnosis did something else, too. Something quieter. It gave him a frame. Thomas Shelby had been running since 1919. From the tunnel, from Greta's grave, from Grace's ghost. From everything the war had made him and everything the years since had added to it. The tuberculoma gave the running a finish line. Whether or not he could accept the grief of Ruby, whether or not he could sit still with any of it, he now knew that eventually the movement would stop. His body would stop it for him. The irony the show buried in that diagnosis was precise and almost cruel. The man who could not stop moving was going to be stopped by something he had been carrying since the one time in his life he had chosen to be still. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But before any of the preparation, before the methodical arranging of his final months, there was something in the diagnosis that forced a different kind of reckoning. Something about the marriage he had built on the wrong foundations, the woman he had made a wife when he was capable of making her nothing more than a function, and the slow destruction of the only domestic life he had left. That story had been running underneath everything else across 6 seasons, and Ruby's death had brought it to a point of no return. Section 6. The marriage he could not make real. Approximately 1 month after Grace died, Tommy went to Lizzie Stark. Not to talk. Not for comfort in the way most people understand comfort. Lizzie herself described what those nights looked like in Season 3, Episode 4, when she told Polly and Esme about it directly and with barely contained fury. She said they did not really sleep. That sleeping was not what happened. That it was physical and rough and conducted with the energy of a man trying to press something down rather than a man reaching toward another person. She described being pushed up against a desk. She was angry when she said it, not because she had not known what she was agreeing to. She was clear-eyed about Tommy in a way that most people around him were not. But because she understood exactly what she was being used as, and the understanding did not make it easier to live with. Lizzie Stark had worked as a prostitute before Tommy employed her as his secretary. The show established this early, and did not treat it as a defining fact about her character. It was part of her history, not her identity. But it mattered in the specific context of what Tommy did after Grace died. He went to the one woman in his immediate world who was practiced at providing physical presence without requiring emotional reciprocity in return. Whether he chose her consciously for that reason, or simply because she was there and willing,
is something the show left open. The result was the same either way. At the Shelby family meeting at the end of season 3, Tommy said something in front of his brothers and his aunt that was either one of the most honest things he ever admitted in company or one of the most clinical.
He told them that Lizzie had been the one who stopped his heart from breaking on some nights after Grace's death.
He said it plainly, the way he might report a fact about a business arrangement. Not as a declaration of love or gratitude, as a statement about function. Lizzie had served a purpose during the worst period of his life, and he was acknowledging it in the most Tommy Shelby way possible, by describing it in terms of what it had prevented, rather than what it had given him. He married her. Not immediately. The marriage came later, confirmed across the show's timeline, after the Changreta War of Season 4 and Tommy's entry into Parliament at the end of that season. By the time Season 5 began, Tommy and Lizzie were husband and wife. They had a daughter named Ruby. Charles, Grace's son, the boy who had been at the center of the threat in Season 3 when a card reading Charles Shelby R.I.P. had been placed under his pillow, was also part of the household.
The family looked, from the outside, like a version of what Tommy had always said he wanted.
Respectability, legitimacy, a house, a wife, children, a seat in Parliament. From the inside, it was a house with a ghost in every room. Grace's presence in Tommy's mind never went away. The hallucinations, which grew more frequent across seasons 3 and 4 and reached their peak in season 5, were not something Lizzie could compete with. She was married to a man whose emotional life was almost entirely occupied by a woman who had been dead for years. She knew this. The show allowed Lizzie a clear and unsentimental understanding of her own position. She was not naive about Tommy, had never been naive about him, and could read the shape of their marriage without being told what it meant. Tommy was present in the house. He was absent in every way that counted. In Season 4, Episode 3, Tommy took Lizzie to a place beneath a bridge he said he had not visited in a long time.
He told her that a girl used to wait for him there for hours when he could not make it.
He stood at this location with his current companion and spoke about someone from his past, as if he had simply found himself in the neighborhood and been reminded of something. He was not cruel about it. He was not trying to hurt Lizzie by saying it. That was almost the harder version. He was simply unaware, or insufficiently aware, of what it felt like for the woman beside him to be taken on a visit to the memory of someone else. The marriage produced a daughter who died. It produced years of Lizzie managing a household around a man who was running a criminal empire, sitting in Parliament, managing the opium trade through a Chinese connection, fighting off the Billy Boys, working against Mosley from the inside while appearing to work with him, and doing all of this while carrying a grief he had never actually set down from the moment the bullet hit Grace at that dinner in Season 3.
Lizzie held the domestic structure of Tommy's life together while he was doing everything except be present in it.
Then came Diana Mitford. In Season 6, Tommy slept with Diana Mitford, the aristocratic woman who was in a relationship with Oswald Mosley and a prominent figure in the British fascist movement of the 1930s. The show confirmed this happened as something Tommy did in exchange for Diana's support of a cause he was building toward. It was not a romance. It was not an affair in the emotional sense. It was a transaction, the same way so many things in Tommy's life were transactions. A thing he gave in exchange for something he needed from someone who had the power to give it. Mosley understood the leverage this created. He sent Diana to Tommy's family home with the explicit intention of telling Lizzie what had happened. Diana arrived and told her.
The delivery was designed to cause maximum damage. It came directly to Lizzie's home, in front of her, framed as information Lizzie deserved to have.
Mosley's reasoning, as the show confirmed, was that he believed Tommy deserved better than the life he had built, and that breaking the marriage was a way of pushing Tommy further into the world Mosley was building. He used Tommy's infidelity as a tool to reshape Tommy's circumstances. Lizzie left. She took Charles with her. She packed and removed herself and Grace's son from the house that Tommy had built as a monument to his own arrival in the world of respectability. The Wikipedia page on Thomas Shelby confirmed this plainly. Lizzie leaves Tommy after his affair with Diana, taking Charles. Tommy, after Lizzie left, had the rest of the Peaky Blinders dismantle the house. He did not sell it or hand it to someone or leave it standing. He had it taken apart. The furniture, the contents, everything he had accumulated as evidence of the life he had built. He had the people who worked for him remove it piece by piece. The house that Lizzie had managed and Ruby had lived in and Charles had grown up in was stripped back to its walls. The gesture was consistent with everything the show had established about how Tommy processed the end of things. He did not grieve dwellings or arrangements or the structures of lives he had tried to build. He removed them. He cleared the space. The forward movement that had been his response to every loss since Greta's death in 1913 expressed itself at the end of season 6 in the physical act of having his own house taken apart, so that nothing of what it had been remained. What the Lizzie marriage represented across its entire span was something the show showed clearly through accumulation, rather than through any single dramatic moment. Tommy had married a woman he respected and relied on, and could not love the way she deserved to be loved. Not because Lizzie was inadequate, because the part of Tommy that had been capable of giving that kind of love had been occupied. First by Greta, then by Grace, and then by Grace's ghost. For so long that there was no available space left for Lizzie to occupy. He had been honest with himself about this, in his way. The description at the family meeting, that Lizzie had stopped his heart from breaking on some nights, was as honest an account of what she meant to him as he was capable of giving. She was the thing that kept him from fully falling apart in the period immediately after Grace's death. That was real. That was something. But it was not the foundation of a marriage. It was the foundation of a debt he could not repay, and an arrangement that wore both of them down across the years of its existence. Grace had made the tunnels quiet. Lizzie made the nights survivable. The distance between those two descriptions is the distance between what Tommy experienced as love and what he was able to offer in return. The show never allowed Lizzie to be diminished by this. She was not a victim in the simple sense. She made choices with clear eyes. She stayed longer than most people would have stayed. She managed a household and raised children and maintained a life around a man who was emotionally living somewhere else for the entirety of their marriage. When she finally left, it was not a collapse or a breaking point in the dramatic sense. It was a woman doing the thing she should have done years earlier, and doing it because the last available reason to stay, the possibility that Tommy might eventually turn toward her fully, had been replaced by a scene in which a fascist aristocrat arrived at her home to tell her about her husband's infidelity on behalf of Oswald Mosley. Tommy ended season 6 alone in the physical sense. The house was gone. Lizzie was gone. Charles was gone. Ruby was gone. Arthur was in withdrawal and failing. The Peaky Blinders, as they had existed across 6 seasons, were being dismantled in the same way Tommy had dismantled his house. Piece by piece, until the structure that had held them all together for 20 years was no longer standing. The isolation at the end was not a new state. It was the original state, finally made visible. Tommy had been alone inside himself since the tunnels. Every person who had gotten close, Greta, Grace, Lizzie, his brothers, his Aunt Polly,
had either been taken by death or driven out by the accumulated weight of who he was and what his presence cost the people around him. The house being dismantled was just the exterior finally matching the interior. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But before all of this came down, before the diagnosis and the isolation and the final reckoning, Tommy had spent years trying to build an escape through a completely different route. Not through love or family or domestic life, through power, through Parliament, through the belief, sustained across seasons 4 and 5, that if he could reach a position legitimate enough and influential enough, the man who had been made in a tunnel in France could be replaced by someone his world could not touch. That attempt, and what it cost him, is its own story.
Section 7. The man who brought the razor blades into Parliament. The plan, as Tommy understood it, was straightforward. Get legitimate, get powerful. Get far enough above the world he had come from that the world he had come from could no longer reach him. Build something so large and so officially recognized that Thomas Shelby the tunneler, Thomas Shelby the gang leader, Thomas Shelby the man who had spent 20 years operating in the space between the law and everything underneath it, that person would eventually be replaced by something else, something untouchable, something the world would have to address with a title rather than a threat. The OBE came first, an Order of the British Empire, a formal honor given by the Crown to people who had performed significant service to the country. Tommy obtained his through blackmail. The Screen Rant piece on the subject confirmed this without ambiguity. He did not earn it through charity or public service, or the kind of quiet good works that typically produced such honors. He leveraged information he had about someone in a position of power and used that leverage to obtain the credential he needed to be taken seriously in rooms where credentials were checked at the door. He was awarded the honor. He began wearing spectacles. He moved through England's upper class with the OBE, providing a layer of legitimacy that his actual history could not. His companies became officially legitimate. His wealth, which had been accumulating through racing operations and criminal enterprise and various deals across 4 seasons, was now attached to a name that the establishment had formally recognized. The man from Small Heath had a title after his name. Then, at the end of season 4, he ran for Parliament. He ran as the Labour MP for Birmingham South, the party of the working class, the party of the people his family had come from, the people of Small Heath who had watched the Shelby name grow from a local street gang into something that operated across the country. He won. Thomas Shelby, who had fought in the tunnels of France and thrown his medals in the canal and built a criminal empire on the back of that war, was now a member of the House of Commons. The Netflix to Doom timeline of the show captured what this moment looked like from the outside. Tommy's ride of choice by this point was a Bentley. He held a seat in Parliament. The Roaring Twenties had run their course. The Wall Street crash of 1929 had arrived, costing the Shelby Company significant money through Michael's management of their American operations. And into this landscape of financial damage and shifting power, Tommy brought his seat in the House of Commons, and his plan to use political influence the same way he had always used every other kind of influence, as a tool for achieving outcomes that served his purposes. The first person he met at the Houses of Commons who mattered was Sir Oswald Mosley. Mosley was a real historical figure, a British politician who would go on to lead the British Union of Fascists, the movement that aligned itself with Adolf Hitler's Germany in the years leading up to the Second World War. The show placed Tommy in direct contact with Mosley as the central conflict of Season 5, and what developed between them was one of the most dangerous games Tommy had ever tried to play. Mosley was charming,
intelligent, and operating with a clarity of vision that Tommy recognized as genuinely threatening. The Collider piece on Season 6 described what Tommy tried to do. He pledged his political loyalty to Mosley publicly, while secretly feeding intelligence about the fascist movement to the British government. He was running a double operation, appearing to support Mosley's rising movement from the inside, while actually working to dismantle it from the same position. He had Winston Churchill's knowledge of what he was doing. He was, in theory, a government asset, operating inside a fascist political network. The Peaky Blinders wiki confirmed the specific shape of Tommy's role as MP. He began relaying information about Mosley to the British government. He felt increasingly threatened by Mosley, by the Billy Boys gang from Glasgow, whose leader, Jimmy McCavern, was pushing against the Peaky Blinders' territory, by Michael Gray's ambitions to restructure the Shelby Company with himself in charge, and by the general pressure of holding all of these things simultaneously while his mental health was deteriorating in ways he could not fully control. At a ballet event, Mosley announced publicly to the assembled crowd that he and Tommy were involved together in the new British fascism movement. Tommy was placed in front of an audience in a position he had not chosen and could not immediately escape from. Mosley had used the public setting to make Tommy's association with him a matter of record, removing the option of quiet distance Tommy might otherwise have maintained. Tommy's response was to plan Mosley's death. The assassination plan involved Barney Thompson, a former soldier from the First World War who had been confined to a mental asylum in the years since France. Tommy went to the asylum to find him. He sat with a man who had been broken by the same war that had broken Tommy, who had ended up behind the walls of an institution while Tommy had ended up behind the walls of a parliament building, and recruited him for a job that required precision and nerve. Barney agreed. He came out of the asylum and joined the plan. The plan also involved Alfie Solomons, the Jewish gang boss Tommy had worked with across multiple seasons, who had survived being shot by Tommy in a previous confrontation, and who Tommy visited to organize a public riot that would serve as cover for the assassination. Aberama Gold was also part of the operation. Multiple moving pieces, arranged with the same tactical precision Tommy brought to every significant operation he had run since Season 1. Everything failed. The assassination did not happen. The plan was foiled. The show later revealed through Captain Swing that the foiling had been orchestrated, that there were forces working against Tommy who had enough information about his operation to stop it at the critical moment. Barney Thompson was killed. Aberama Gold was killed, and Polly Gray, Tommy's aunt, the woman who had kept the family alive while the brothers were in France, the person who had been the emotional foundation of the Shelby family across 5 full seasons, was assassinated by IRA members connected to the fascist movement. Tommy had gone into Parliament to escape the world that produced violence and death. Parliament became the mechanism through which the most devastating loss of Season 5 arrived. Polly died because of what Tommy was doing in his role as an MP. The political game he was playing, the double operation, the intelligence feeding, the public fascist alignment paired with private government cooperation, had costs that were paid by the people around him rather than by Tommy himself. This was the recurring structure of Tommy's attempts to go legitimate across the entire show. Every time he reached for something cleaner, something further from the tunnels and the razor blades and the world that Smallheath had made him, the thing he reached for became the instrument of someone else's destruction. The charity foundation named after Grace was used by Father Hughes and the Economic League as leverage over Tommy in Season 3. Parliament became the arena in which Polly was killed. The attempt to clean the money and the name and the history
produced damage at the same rate as the criminal enterprise had, just in slightly different packaging. The Collider piece on Season 6 identified what happened after the Season 5 failure with precise clarity. Tommy was strong-armed into embracing Mosley's politics to save his own hide after the assassination failed and the IRA made their position clear. The double operation was over. The distance Tommy had maintained between his public alliance with Mosley and his private opposition to him collapsed.
By Season 6, he was tolerating Mosley in a more direct and visible way, meeting with him, coordinating with him, and working with Jack Nelson, the Boston gang leader who wanted connections to the English fascist movement in exchange for access to American opium markets. Tommy was still a Labor MP during all of this. The man elected to represent the working people of Birmingham South was trading opium access for political intelligence with a Boston criminal and a British fascist, while simultaneously preparing to die from what he believed was an inoperable brain tumor. The distance between what his seat in Parliament was supposed to represent and what he was actually doing while holding it was not a gap. It was a chasm.
The Collider piece named this precisely. Tommy's role as a Labor MP technically gave him the opportunity to create long-awaited change in his impoverished Birmingham community. But his interest in politics had always also been about the accumulation of power and security for his criminal family. The two purposes, genuine service to the people who elected him and the protection and advancement of the Shelby enterprise, had coexisted uneasily from the moment he took the seat. By Season 6, the second purpose had consumed the first almost entirely. He had walked into Parliament with a razor blade hidden in the lining of a legitimate suit. He thought the suit would eventually replace the razor blade. The razor blade replaced the suit instead. The OBE obtained through blackmail. The seat won through a combination of real community standing and criminal leverage. The anti-fascist double operation that ended in the death of his aunt and the failure of the plan. The opium deal conducted from a Parliament building. The false tuberculoma diagnosis delivered to a man who was still, technically, a sitting member of the House of Commons. Thomas Shelby's political career was the show's most extended and detailed demonstration of a single principle. You cannot use the tools of one world to build a life in another world. The tools remember where they came from. They do what they were made to do. Tommy had believed, at some level, that power was the thing he had been denied in the tunnels. That the clay kicker, who had no control over whether the Germans broke through the wall, could eventually become someone who controlled enough of the surrounding territory that nobody could get through the wall at all. Parliament was supposed to be the ultimate wall, the highest position, the most fortified version of the defense he had been building since 1919. Mosley walked through it without breaking a sweat. He had found someone who operated in the same space Tommy did, the space between legitimate public identity and private manipulation, and who was better at it, or at least differently equipped for it. Tommy had always won by being the most prepared person in any given confrontation. Mosley was prepared in ways Tommy had not fully accounted for. He had the advantage of genuine, true belief. He was not performing fascism as a strategy. He actually believed in what he was building. And that made him harder to outmaneuver than an enemy who was simply pursuing money, or territory, or revenge. The first enemy across 6 seasons who genuinely defeated Thomas Shelby was not a gangster, or a policeman, or a government agency. It was an elected politician. The world Tommy had tried to enter and use as an escape route turned out to contain the most dangerous opponent he had ever faced. And yet even this, the political failure, the Mosley defeat, the death of Polly. The field and the gun and the empty chamber at the end of Season 5 was not the complete picture of what Thomas Shelby could not escape. Because underneath the politics and the criminal enterprise and the grief and the tunnels, there was something structural about the way he was built that none of the external events could fully explain on their own. The pattern of self-destruction that ran through every section of his life had roots that went deeper than France and deeper than Greta's grave. Understanding what Tommy truly could not escape requires looking at the one thing the show returned to in every season, in every situation, across every year of his story. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The thing he could never escape was himself. And what that actually means, stripped of the poetry, is a story told most clearly in what he did to the people who needed him most. Section 8. The cost of standing near him. Polly Gray ran the Shelby family while Tommy and his brothers were in France. This is not a minor detail or a piece of background information. It is the foundational fact of the Shelby family's survival. While Tommy was underground in the tunnels, while Arthur and John were somewhere on the Western Front doing the brutal work of a war that should have killed all of them, Polly was in Birmingham, keeping the business running, keeping the family together, keeping the children fed and the money moving and the name from disappearing into the poverty that surrounded Small Heath from every direction. She did this without the status of the family's leader. She did this without being asked. She did this because someone had to, and she was the one who was there. Tommy came back from France and took the leadership position that Polly had been holding in trust for him. He walked back into the family structure and resumed the role of the person everyone else organized themselves around. And Polly stepped back. Not because she had to. Not because she was less capable than Tommy of running what the Shelbys had built, but because she understood what Tommy needed and chose to give it to him. Across 5 seasons, she was the closest thing the show had to a moral center for the Shelby family. She told Tommy the truth when almost nobody else would. She challenged his decisions when she believed they were wrong. She protected the family from the inside while Tommy protected it from the outside. And the two of them together were the reason the Shelby name survived as long as it did. Tommy's plan to assassinate Mosley got her killed. The IRA members who killed Polly at the end of Season 5 were connected to the fascist movement Tommy had been operating inside of through his double role. Publicly allied with Mosley, privately feeding intelligence to the government. Captain Swing, who contacted Tommy after the field and the empty gun, confirmed that she had been responsible for foiling the assassination attempt. The IRA returned Polly's body. The Peaky Blinders wiki confirmed this directly. Polly Gray was assassinated by the IRA, and her body was returned alongside those of Barney Thompson and Aberama Gold. She died because of what Tommy was doing, not because she had made any choice that put her in the path of that particular danger. Because Tommy's plan had consequences that extended beyond Tommy, and the consequence this time was the death of the woman who had kept his family alive while he was underground in France, learning to survive by listening for shovels through a mud wall. What made Polly's death particularly devastating within the structure of the Shelby story was not just the loss of a person. It was the specific nature of what she had been to Tommy throughout the show. Polly had told him the truth when the truth was uncomfortable. In Season 1, she told Ada about her own children being taken by the police. And she told Ada to forgive Tommy because he was the one who had brought strength to the family. The one who would make sure what happened to her children did not happen to Ada's. She was defending him to the people who had reason not to trust him, running interference for his leadership before the leadership was fully established. She had also, at various points across the seasons, pushed back against his decisions directly and without softening the push. When she told the family meeting at the end of Season 3 that she would like to put before the family an alternative view of the future, a more hopeful view, she called it, one she would quite like to hear, she was doing what she always did, offering Tommy a door out of the direction he was moving in, showing him that another version of the path existed. He did not take the door. He kept moving. And the direction he kept moving in eventually produced the circumstances in which she was killed. She had also endured things within the Shelby world that the show confirmed as part of the cost of proximity to Tommy's operations. In Season 3, Polly was arrested as part of the government's pressure on the Shelby family. The experience of her time in custody was not treated lightly by the show. It left marks on her that ran through her arc in subsequent seasons. She had paid personal costs for the family's position that she had not chosen and had not been fully protected from. Michael Gray, Polly's son, swore revenge on Tommy for his role in Polly's death. The Wikipedia page on Thomas Shelby confirmed this. Michael believed, with reason, that Tommy's decisions had led directly to his mother being killed. The family meeting in Season 6, at which Tommy introduced his newly found son Duke to the family, was also the meeting at which the damage from Season 5 was fully visible. Michael gone, Polly gone, the family fracturing along lines that Tommy's choices had drawn. Arthur Shelby had been letting Tommy win since they were children. This emerged in the basement scene of Season 6, Episode 4, in the Peaky Blinders Wiki's account of the Sapphire episode. Tommy went down to find Arthur in serious withdrawal from opium, the addiction Arthur had developed through the Chinese business Tommy had been running. A business that had gotten Arthur hooked on the drug that was both the source of the Shelby Company's income and the thing that was currently destroying Arthur's ability to function. They sat together in the basement and talked about their past. Arthur brought up a fight they had once had over cigarettes. He told Tommy that he had let him win. He had always known he was letting him win. And he had been doing versions of that same thing, stepping back, letting Tommy lead, giving Tommy the space to be the person the family followed, for the entire span of their lives. Arthur said that he had sacrificed himself to allow Tommy to prosper. He said this in the basement, in the middle of withdrawal, with his hands shaking and his body failing from the addiction that had developed inside a business Tommy had built. He was not accusing Tommy. He was stating a fact about the shape of their relationship, the way someone states a fact they have known for a long time and are finally saying out loud, because the situation has become extreme enough that silence feels less honest than speech. The addiction itself was directly connected to Tommy's operations. The Chinese business that Arthur had been running, which Tommy then shut down in Season 6 by walking into the Chinese shop, taking their remaining drugs, and throwing them into the canal with a bomb, had been the source of Arthur's exposure to the opium that destroyed his Season 6 functionality. Tommy dismantled the operation with characteristic decisiveness after it had already done its damage to his brother. He removed the supply after Arthur was already dependent on it. Arthur had also saved Tommy's life at the end of Season 5. He had removed the bullets from Tommy's gun before walking ahead and leaving Tommy alone in the field with Grace's hallucination. This was confirmed in the Peaky Blinders Wiki's account of the Season 6 opening. Arthur had emptied all the bullets out of Tommy's gun beforehand. Tommy did not know this when he pressed the gun to his head and screamed. He did not know until afterward, if he ever knew at all, that his life had been preserved by a quiet act of care his older brother had performed without being asked and without announcing it. Arthur had been protecting Tommy since the tunnels in France, and he had been doing it so quietly and so completely that the protection was invisible from the inside. Tommy experienced himself as the protector, the person running the operations, carrying the weight, making the decisions. Arthur experienced himself as the person who stepped back so Tommy could step forward, and who removed the bullets from his brother's gun when the stepping forward led to a field in the dark, with Grace's ghost telling him to pull the trigger. The cigarette fight that Arthur described in the basement was the show's way of saying something enormous in a very small frame. A fight over cigarettes between two boys in Small Heath. Arthur winning, and then choosing not to win. Choosing to let his younger brother have the thing, not because the thing mattered, but because even then, even as children, Arthur had understood something about what Tommy needed that Tommy could not understand about himself. Tommy needed to win, not because he was arrogant or greedy or power-hungry in the simple sense, because the world he had been born into, the absent father, the mother who did not survive, the poverty of Small Heath, and the stigma of the Romani name, had taught him that not winning was how you disappeared. Arthur had understood this about his brother, and had been giving ground to him ever since. Across all the years, across the criminal empire and the parliament seat and the marriages and the losses, still stepping back, still letting Tommy step forward. Until the stepping forward led to a field at night, and Arthur had to make a quiet decision about 6 bullets. John Shelby died in season 4. John was the third Shelby brother, younger than Tommy and Arthur, married to Esme Lee as part of Tommy's strategic alliance with the Lee family in season 1. He was shot and killed by the Changretta family during the vendetta that defined season 4. The Changretta War had roots that stretched back to John's actions. John had cut Angel Changretta's throat, blinding him in one eye, which set in motion the chain of events that led to Grace being shot at the charity dinner in season 3, and then to the Changretta family sending killers after the Shelbys in season 4. John died as part of the long consequence of choices made within Tommy's world, inside an operation Tommy led, as a member of a family Tommy commanded. He was not the only one. The Peaky Blinders wiki listed the people whose deaths connected to Tommy's decisions and Tommy's proximity across the 6 seasons. Bonnie Gold, Ben Younger, Barney Thompson, Aberama Gold, Polly Gray, Angel Changretta, Vicente Changretta, and many others who died during or as a result of operations Tommy ran or situations Tommy created. The pattern across all of it was consistent. Tommy did not set out to destroy the people around him. He loved his brothers in the specific and limited way the tunnels had left him capable of love. Fiercely, protectively, and with a control orientation that made his care and his danger inseparable. He protected Arthur and John and Finn and Ada the same way he protected himself. By managing the situation, by staying 2 moves ahead, by treating family relationships the way he treated every other relationship, as something to be maintained through strategy rather than felt through presence. The problem with that approach, applied to the people who needed something more than strategic management, is that it left them in positions Tommy had constructed for them, rather than positions they had chosen. John died inside a vendetta that had Tommy's fingerprints on every stage of its development. Arthur became addicted to a substance that circulated through a business Tommy built. Polly was killed because of a plan Tommy made and executed, without being able to protect her from its consequences. Lizzie spent years in a marriage where her husband's emotional life was entirely occupied by a dead woman. Tommy had also, earlier in the show, arranged Freddie Thorne's arrest. Freddie was Ada's husband, Tommy's sister's partner, a communist organizer whom Tommy viewed as a threat to the family's stability and safety. Tommy gave information that led to Freddie being imprisoned. He later helped arrange Freddie's release. He held the power over Freddie's freedom in both directions: the decision to have him taken and the decision to have him returned,
and exercised both as a function of what served the family's interests at each particular moment. Freddie died later of illness. Ada never fully forgave the earlier betrayal, and the show confirmed that Ada came back to Birmingham not for Tommy or the business, but for love and her own reasons. Ada Shelby, the one sibling who had left the world of the Peaky Blinders most completely, who had lived the most separate life from the criminal enterprise, told Tommy directly at one point that she had come back for love and common sense. Not for him, not for the family business. She had built a life at a distance from what Tommy had made, and the distance was a choice. The Peaky Blinders wiki also confirms something about Tommy and the suicidal patterns within the family that extended beyond just Tommy's own history. His uncle Charlie, who had worked with the family throughout the show as the operator of the yard, stated that both Tommy's grandfather and his mother had died by suicide. The tendency toward that particular darkness was not unique to Tommy. It ran through the family line. Arthur had attempted to hang himself earlier in the show, after their father had taken money from him under false pretenses and disappeared. Both Shelby brothers carried the same pull towards self-destruction in different forms, and both had survived it through versions of the same mechanism: someone else's intervention, someone else's care, arriving at the critical moment. The difference between Tommy and Arthur in how they process damage was something the show illustrated quietly across every season. Arthur externalized. His pain became rage. His rage became violence. His violence became the thing that made him most dangerous and most visible. When Arthur was in trouble, the room knew about it. When Arthur was breaking, something broke with him. Furniture, faces, the quiet of whatever space he occupied. His damage was loud. Tommy's damage was silent and internal, and directed primarily at himself. He internalized everything: the guilt, the grief, the accumulated weight of every decision and its consequences. He pressed it all down beneath the surface and kept the surface smooth and controlled and impossible to read. This was the tunnel skill applied to emotional life. Staying very still, making no sound, giving nothing away to whoever might be listening from the other side of the wall. The cost of that approach was paid by the people around him in consistent and predictable ways. They could not reach him. They could not find the place in him where the pain was living, because he had learned to make that place completely inaccessible. Lizzie could not reach it. Arthur could only reach it in basements during withdrawal, in moments of extreme vulnerability, when the normal defenses were too exhausted to hold. Grace had reached it, which was why her loss was catastrophic in a way that nothing before or after quite matched. She had found the place where the tunnel lived and made it quiet. And when she was gone, the tunnel and its silence and its inaccessibility came back as permanent conditions rather than temporary ones. Finn Shelby, the youngest of the brothers, kept at the edges of the family business across the earlier seasons because Tommy and Arthur were determined to protect him from the worst of it. Eventually found himself pulled into the operations anyway. The protection Tommy extended to Finn was real. The intention behind it was genuine. But the world Tommy had built around the family had no clean edges. There was no inside the business and outside the business in the way Tommy sometimes talked as if there were. The Shelby name and the Shelby operations and the Shelby enemies moved through the family as a whole, regardless of which individual members Tommy had designated as protected. Finn was shot in the arm during the Mosley assassination attempt in Season 5, the one Tommy had specifically instructed him to stay back from and let the other men handle. He was shot despite the instruction. The protection was theoretical. The bullet was not. The people who needed Tommy most, his daughter, his wife, his brothers, his aunt, needed something he had learned through 20 years of survival to make unavailable. They needed him to sit still. They needed him to be present, without agenda. They needed him to feel the weight of what was happening, without immediately converting that weight into forward movement and strategy, and the next operation, and the next plan. The clay kicker, who survived by never stopping moving, could not give the people he loved the one thing proximity to him required. What this produced, across 6 seasons, was a man surrounded by damage he had not intended and could not undo, and who understood, at some level, the shape of what he was. The show allowed Tommy moments of genuine self-awareness that made his inability to change all the more devastating. He knew what the tunnel had done to him. He knew what it cost Lizzie to be his wife. He knew that Polly's death connected to his decisions. He knew that Arthur's sacrifice had been running quietly underneath their entire relationship. Knowing did not change anything. Understanding the prison does not open the door. And the nature of what Thomas Shelby could not escape from was never more clearly visible than in the final accounting of what being near him had cost the people who chose to stay. But there was one more thing the show had not yet finished with. One more layer underneath all of it. The oldest layer, the one that preceded France and Greta and everything else. The thing that the show built its final argument around, expressed most clearly in a dying diagnosis that turned out to be false, and what Tommy did in the hours between believing he was dying and discovering he was not. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But there was one more thing the show had not yet finished with. One more layer underneath all of it. The oldest layer. The one that preceded France and Greta and everything else. The thing that the show built its final argument around, expressed most clearly in a dying diagnosis that turned out to be false. And what Tommy did in the hours between believing he was dying and discovering he was not. Section 9. The man who needed to die to start living. Tommy Shelby had been preparing for death since 1919. Not consciously. Not in the way a person makes a plan, or writes a will, or organizes their affairs in advance of something they know is coming. He had been preparing for it the way a person prepares for something they half expect and half invite, by never fully committing to the life they were living, by keeping one part of themselves permanently available to leave, by treating the future as a concept that applied to other people rather than a destination he was actually moving toward. The tunnels had started it. The belief, formed underground in France during the worst work of the war, that he had already died, and everything after was borrowed time. He had said this directly at some point across the show's run, that he believed he had died in France. He was not speaking poetically. He meant it as a genuine account of how he understood his own existence. The man who came back from the Western Front was living on credit. At some point, the bill would arrive. The tuberculoma diagnosis in Season 6, Episode 4, was when Tommy believed the bill had arrived. Dr. Holford delivered the news after Tommy finally agreed to see a doctor, after Lizzie had been urging him, after the seizures had been happening since his voyage back from America, after the hallucinations had moved from sleep into waking hours, and from his bedroom into his office at Parliament. The diagnosis was specific and detailed. Tommy's lungs were clear of active tuberculosis, but at the base of his skull, there was a mass, a tuberculoma, caused by the same bacteria that had killed Ruby. It was growing rapidly. It was positioned in a place where operating on it was not possible. Between 12 and 18 months remained.
The show had been seeding the physical symptoms carefully across the early episodes of Season 6. The seizures beginning on the voyage home from America. The hallucinations intensifying. The moments of weakness and erratic behavior that Tommy had been managing and concealing with the same discipline he applied to everything he did not want the world to see. When Holford laid out the diagnosis, the symptoms Tommy had been dismissing for months suddenly had a shape and a timeline attached to them. They were not stress. They were not grief. They were a mass at the base of his brain, expanding, with a clock running. Tommy heard it and did what Tommy always did with information. He processed it into a set of conditions. He had 12 to 18 months. There were things that needed to happen before that time ran out. There were people to arrange, enemies to settle, promises to fulfill. The promise to Greta, the dying girl at Blackpool Beach who had asked him to change the world, had been running underneath everything for 20 years. The time remaining meant that the promise needed its final accounting. He began to prepare. He introduced Duke, the son he had only just discovered he had, the product of one night at the Appleby Fair in May 1914 with a Romani woman named Zelda, to the family at a meeting. Duke was 20 years old by this point, a gypsy who had been working the fairground without knowing who his father was. Tommy had found out about him through Esme during the Season 6 search for the curse that he believed was killing Ruby. He brought Duke into the Shelby world and presented him to the family as the person who would eventually lead what Tommy would leave behind. Lizzie did not receive Duke's arrival well. The Peaky Blinders wiki confirmed this directly. Tommy introducing a previously unknown son to the family household was not a conversation Lizzie had been part of, not a decision she had been consulted on, not something that had been shared with her in advance. It was Tommy arranging the pieces of his legacy in the way he arranged everything, unilaterally, with full confidence that his assessment of what needed to happen was correct, and with limited consideration for what the people most directly affected by the arrangement might feel about it. He slept with Diana Mitford. This happened in Season 6 as a transaction, something Tommy gave in exchange for Diana's support of a political operation he was building. The show confirmed it. Tommy understood what he was doing and made the choice with clear eyes. Mosley then used this information as a weapon, sending Diana to the family home to tell Lizzie directly. Lizzie left, taking Charles with her. Tommy had the house dismantled. The physical structure of his domestic life was removed piece by piece until nothing of it remained. All of this, the introduction of Duke, the affair with Diana, the dismantling of the house, happened while Tommy believed he was dying. A man with 12 to 18 months left, arranging the final shape of things, making decisions in the way a person makes decisions when they believe the future belongs to someone else rather than to them. Then came the moment the show built Season 6 toward. Tommy, having accepted the diagnosis and completed as many of the arrangements he felt needed to be made, prepared to die on his own terms. The show had established across 5 seasons that Tommy's relationship with his own death was complicated. The suicidal ideation in Season 5, the hallucinations of Grace inviting him to join her, the gun in the field with the empty chamber. But this was different. The Season 5 field had been a collapse, a breaking point, a moment when the accumulated weight simply exceeded his capacity to carry it. The Season 6 preparation was deliberate. He was not breaking. He was choosing. He said goodbye to his family. He spoke to Polly, his dead aunt, asking her to give him the time he needed to do what he still had to do. He made the final pieces of the farewell that a man makes when he has accepted that the end is close and is trying to leave things in reasonable order for the people who will remain. And then, in the place where he went to die on his terms,
He saw his daughter.
A vision of Ruby appeared, the child he had not been there for when she died. The 7-year-old who had repeated Romani words in her sickness and drawn pictures of the gray man, and died while Tommy was somewhere else trying to stop the thing that was killing her. Ruby appeared and directed his attention toward something specific. A partially burned newspaper in which Dr. Holford appeared in a photograph alongside Oswald Mosley. The tuberculoma had been a lie. Holford was Mosley's man. The diagnosis had been fabricated, a strategy Mosley had developed to remove Tommy from the board without the messiness of a direct confrontation. A false medical verdict, delivered with enough clinical detail and enough physical symptoms already present to be completely believable. Designed to make Tommy believe he was dying so that he would stop being a threat. Mosley had found a way to kill Thomas Shelby without killing him. He had used Tommy's grief and his damaged body and his willingness to finally believe that the bill from France had arrived. And he had constructed a sentence of death out of paperwork and a doctor in his pocket. Tommy had spent weeks preparing to die. He had said his goodbyes. He had arranged his legacy. He had let Lizzie go and had the house dismantled, and had broken his sobriety, and had made peace with his dead aunt in his mind, and had begun the slow, methodical process of releasing his grip on the world he had been holding so tightly since the tunnels. He had done all of this on the basis of a diagnosis that was false. What the false diagnosis revealed about Tommy was more significant than the diagnosis itself would have been if it were real. In the weeks between hearing the verdict and discovering it was a lie, Tommy did things he had been incapable of doing while he believed he was going to live. He sat in a basement with Arthur and talked about their childhood. He broke sobriety to drink with his brother, not to numb something or to manage a situation, but just to be with the person he had been standing next to since Small Heath, before France, before all of it. He spoke to Polly's absence as if she could hear him. He said the things that the forward momentum of being Thomas Shelby had made impossible to say while the forward momentum was still running at full speed. The dying, even the false dying, had done something the living had not managed across 6 seasons. It had stopped him long enough to be present. It had removed the forward momentum, the relentless movement that the tunnel had made into a survival requirement, and replaced it with the only condition in which Tommy Shelby could actually feel the full weight of his own life. He had to believe he was leaving it. This was the cruelest and most precise thing the show ever did with his character. The man who could not sit still at his daughter's deathbed, who could not be at Greta's bedside in the way he was before the war, who had built 20 years of survival on the principle that stopping meant dying. That man could finally stop only when he believed stopping was unavoidable. He did not choose stillness. He had stillness imposed on him by a false diagnosis from an enemy's doctor. And in that imposed stillness, he became, briefly, partially, the person he had been before France. He went to find Holford after discovering the lie. He arrived at the doctor's location with every intention of killing him. And then he stopped. He let Holford live. The Tommy Shelby of every previous season would not have done this. The man who had killed Billy Kimber in Season 1, who had killed Angel Changreta and Vicente Changreta, who had shot Alfie Solomons, who had killed Father Hughes, who had killed dozens of people across 6 seasons of the show. That man had a very clear and consistent policy about people who had moved directly against him or his family. He did not spare them. He removed them. It was not cruelty for its own sake. It was the tunnel logic applied to human threats. A broken wall lets the enemy through. so you do not leave broken walls standing. He spared Holford. He recognized something in himself in the moment he had the opportunity to kill. A change that the weeks of dying had produced in him. Something that the false preparation for death had moved in his character. He let the doctor go and walked away. Tommy Shelby, the man who had operated since 1919 on the principle that survival required eliminating threats, chose not to eliminate a threat. Not because he was weak, not because the threat was insufficient to justify it, because the process of preparing to die had changed something in him that the living had not been able to change across 20 years of trying. He returned to what remained. He watched his wagon and his remaining possessions burn. Then he rode away, alone. The Peaky Blinders wiki confirmed this as the image that closed his story in Season 6. Tommy Shelby, on a horse, riding away from everything that the name had meant and built and cost. The tuberculoma was false. The dying had been real. And the person who rode away from the burning wagon was not the same person who had walked into Holford's office believing he had 12 months left. The disease planted by Greta's bedside, if it had ever existed, had not killed him. The diagnosis planted by Mosley's doctor had not killed him. The gun in the field with Arthur's empty chamber had not killed him. The tunnels, and all of their decades of noise inside his head, had not killed him. Thomas Shelby had survived every version of the death that had been waiting for him since 1919. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What he had not survived was being Thomas Shelby. The cost of that, to himself and to everyone who had stood near him across those 20 years, is what the final section of this story is about. Not the dying, the living, and what it meant that someone built the way Tommy was built could never have escaped the pattern of it, no matter what position or title or house or plan he used to try. Section 10. The pattern that preceded everything. The tunnels did not create Thomas Shelby. That distinction matters more than almost anything else about him. Every section of this story has moved through the things that shaped him. The clay kicker's darkness, Greta's deathbed, Grace's ghost, the field and the empty gun, the parliament seat and its failures, the daughter he was not there for, the wife he could not fully love. Each of those things was real. Each of them added weight to something that was already there before any of them arrived. The tunnels accelerated it. The war concentrated it. The years of crime and grief and loss gave it new forms to move through. The thing itself was older than all of that. Thomas Michael Shelby was born around 1890 into a family in Small Heath, Birmingham, a Romani family of Irish traveler descent living in one of the poorest parts of a city that was not generous to its poor. He was the second of 5 children. His mother, confirmed across the show through multiple references, was a woman who struggled deeply and did not survive her own darkness. Uncle Charlie, the man who ran the yard that served as one of the Peaky Blinders' operational bases throughout the show, stated plainly that both Tommy's grandfather and his mother had died by suicide. The tendency was not invented by France. It was inherited. It was in the family line before Tommy was old enough to understand what a family line meant. His father, Arthur Shelby Sr., was absent in every way that mattered. The show confirmed this through Arthur Jr.'s experience with him. Arthur Sr. appeared at the boxing ring in Season 1, having taken a significant sum of money from his son Arthur Jr. under the false promise of building a casino in America. He took the money and disappeared. When Arthur Jr. followed him to the train station and tried to confront him,
His father was physically stronger and more vicious than his son expected. He threatened to kill Arthur before getting on the train and leaving. Tommy knew about what their father had taken and had not told Arthur. The knowledge had sat between them in the way secrets sit between brothers, when one of them decides that protecting the other person from the truth is more important than the truth. A mother who did not survive. A father who left when taking from his children was more convenient than staying for them. A family that held together across poverty and stigma, and the specific prejudice that followed Romani people through England's class structure in the early 20th century. This was what preceded France. This was the ground that the war planted itself in when Tommy came back. The psychologist's analysis of Tommy's character, drawing on established psychological frameworks, identified the substance pattern he used across the show as a window into the internal structure of his coping. Cigarettes kept him sharp and controlled his anxiety, the visible, social version of his management. Whiskey kept him functional in social situations, softening the emotional edges just enough to move through rooms full of people without the full weight of everything pressing through the surface. The opium and later the laudanum were for the night, for sleep, for the tunnels, for the thing that could not be managed any other way. 3 different substances, each one assigned to a specific part of the day and a specific kind of pressure. Each one a tool for keeping down what would otherwise come up. He used none of these substances recreationally. Every one of them was medical in the sense that it was treating something. The cigarettes were not a habit, they were a system. A man who needs a system that precise and that consistent has been managing internal pressure for a very long time. Not since the tunnels, not since Greta, but long before. The substances the war gave him a reason to reach for were waiting for him before the war. The war just provided the official justification. The medals in the canal, thrown in the water the moment he came home from France, were the first in a series of gestures across 6 seasons that all had the same structure. Tommy encountered something that represented what he was, or what he had done, or what the world had made him, and he tried to put it somewhere it could not follow him. The medals went in the water. The opium was supposed to go away when Grace arrived. The criminal world was supposed to be left behind when Parliament became possible. The grief was supposed to go somewhere when Lizzie was made his wife. The house was dismantled when Lizzie left, as if removing the structure would remove the fact of what had happened inside it. None of it worked. Every discarded thing came back. The medals were gone from his hands, but the gallantry that earned them, the tunnel survival, the clay kicker's specific damage, remained in his body and his brain. The opium came back after Grace died. The criminal world followed him into Parliament and made Parliament into its own kind of criminal operation. The grief that Lizzie was supposed to manage remained attached to Grace's ghost, which grew more present and more specific across the seasons rather than fading with time. The house being dismantled left Tommy on a horse, riding away, alone, with everything he had tried to build behind him. The pattern was not caused by the war. The war revealed it and deepened it and gave it new material to work through. The pattern was caused by the first family, by the mother who could not stay and the father who chose to leave, and the children who were left to hold each other together in a part of Birmingham that rewarded toughness and punished softness, and gave no particular support to a Romani boy who had once seen a man hitting a horse and walked straight up to confront him because it was wrong. That boy, the one Kitty Gerosi described, the one visible in the Blackpool photograph with Greta, had been moral before he had been tough. He had principles before he had survival strategies. The sensitivity was the original condition. The coldness came after. built layer by layer over something that was never actually removed, just covered. The show's most careful argument, made slowly across 6 seasons, was that the Thomas Shelby everyone watched moving through Birmingham and London and Parliament was not the real Thomas Shelby. He was the protection that the real Thomas Shelby had built around himself after the mother did not survive and the father left, and France finished the job. The Gray Man, the hallucination that followed Tommy from his dreams in Season 1 all the way into his Parliament office in Season 6, was the show's clearest image of this. The Gray Man appeared to Ruby before she died. He appeared to Tommy across the later seasons with increasing frequency. He was the figure from the tunnel, the specific shape of what France had lodged in Tommy's mind. And he kept appearing in new locations and new contexts because the mind that contained him kept growing, and the thing kept growing with it. By Season 6, he had followed Tommy out of sleep and into the Houses of Parliament. There was no room in Tommy's life, no matter how far from Small Heath or how high above the canal where the medals had landed, that the Gray Man could not reach. Tommy told the world, or told enough of the people around him across the show's run, that he believed he had died in France. He said it in different forms at different moments, with different amounts of directness, but the core statement was consistent. The person who came back from the tunnels was not the person who had gone in. He understood this about himself. He had an accurate account of his own fracture and when it had occurred. He could name the tunnels and the clay kicking and the specifics of what the worst years of that war had done to the people who spent it underground in France. He could describe the PTSD symptoms in the language available to him. The wall that sounded like a tunnel wall, the shovels he prayed the sunrise would beat. Understanding the prison did not open the door. The show was very clear about this. Tommy was not unaware of what he was or how he had become it. He was not a man who had never examined himself. He was a man who had examined himself with full clarity and then continued being himself anyway, because the architecture of what he was had been built before he was old enough to have chosen it, and rebuilt so many times across the decades that followed that the building and the man had become the same thing. This is what made the attempted escapes so painful to watch across 6 seasons. Tommy genuinely tried. The opium was a genuine attempt to survive the tunnels without dying in them. The love he gave Grace was real. The Parliament seat was pursued with actual belief that legitimate power could replace criminal power. The sobriety of Season 6, 4 years without alcohol, was a genuine and sustained effort. These were not performances. He was not pretending to try. He tried with everything available to him. And the thing he was trying to escape from was so thoroughly inside him that every tool he used to escape it was built from the same material as the prison itself. The control that he used to manage every situation was tunnel survival. Listening for shovels, knowing where the threat was before it arrived. The love he was capable of giving was rationed by the knowledge, formed at a deathbed in 1913 and confirmed in France and confirmed again at a charity dinner in 1924, that proximity to the things he loved was how they were destroyed. The ambition was the promise to a dying girl, which could never be fulfilled because the girl could not confirm fulfillment, and so the standard could never be met. The forward movement that prevented him from sitting still at his daughter's deathbed was the movement that had kept him alive underground, when stopping meant dying. Every tool was the trauma. Every escape attempt was built from the walls of the prison. There was no material available to him from outside the thing he was trying to escape from, because everything he had been given to work with, by the family he was born into, by the war he was sent to fight, by the specific sequence of losses that the years between the wars produced,
was the prison. He rode away at the end. A horse, an open field, everything burning behind him. No more house. No more Lizzie. No more Peaky Blinders in the form they had held for 20 years. He rode away from it the way he had thrown the medals in the canal, with the physical gesture of leaving. Whether he escaped in that final image is the question the show left deliberately open. The tuberculoma was false. The gun in the field had no bullets. He had chosen not to kill Holford. He had let something go that the previous version of him would not have released. The dying, even the false dying, had moved something in him. The boy at Blackpool Beach, buried under 20 years of survival, had briefly been visible again in the weeks when Tommy believed he was leaving the world. But the pattern preceded all of it. The inheritance from the mother who did not survive, the father who chose to leave, the tunnel that made movement into survival, and stillness into death. These were not things that a horse ride away from a burning wagon could fully resolve. They were in the body, in the brain, in the place where the tuberculoma had tried to grow and where the gray man kept appearing regardless of which building Tommy was standing in. What the show ultimately argued about Thomas Shelby was not that he was a villain or a hero or a cautionary tale in the simple sense. What it argued was something more uncomfortable and more precise. He was a person shaped by forces that preceded his ability to choose, who then spent 20 years trying to choose his way out of those forces, and who discovered, in the specific and painful way that such discoveries arrive, that choice alone is not enough to overcome a structure that was built before you were old enough to know it was being built. He could not escape himself. The self he was trying to escape from was not the tunnels or the crime or the grief. It was the boy in small Heath before any of it. Before France, before Greta, before the first episode of the show, who was handed a set of conditions for surviving the world that turned out to also be the conditions that made it impossible to fully live in it. The conclusion of his story, and what it says about the distance between surviving and living, is the last thing to account for. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.